that region-wide infrastructure investment in ports, region-wide infrastructure investment in common transit systems, exchanges of employment between suburbs like Brooklyn at that point and the center city of New York was so complex, so involved, so mutually beneficial, so overlapping in interest, that the leadership in Brooklyn ultimately said, they're right. We've got to go in. And not everybody reaches that conclusion, but New York as we know it would have been surpassed originally by Chicago, which was a city capable of annexing unincorporated space, and then later Los Angeles. And neither one of those cities are anywhere near the size or scale of New York. New York would have still remained the largest U.S. metropolitan area, but it would have been buried in the kind of fragmentation that would have prohibited the emergence of things like the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey. The Brooklyn Mass Transit, the BMT, wouldn't be part of a consolidated metro transit in the region. It would perhaps end at the East River. Those kinds of things that made possible a large-scale, reinvention in each generation of economy in New York were possible because of decisions made in the late 19th century that still carry into the early 20th century. So remote are those decisions that virtually no one within that metropolitan area has any background knowledge that ever occurred. It's just a taken for granted reality now. That's not taught to little school kids in the net. I had to learn that in college. I did not learn that in a school in New York and New Jersey where I started school in New York. That was something so obscure because what it was is after those things are done, generations that are brought up post that never knew it existed. Never knew there was any separation. Nobody in Brooklyn I've never met Brooklynites practically even realizes there was a separate urban history of it. Through most of Brooklyn's history, it's a separate space. Thank you. Question? Yep.
Thank you. You comment in your expertise. This committee's charge is interesting in that at the first meeting we had, the chair and some others what appeared to be a very controversial proposal of the city reentering the county and all those sorts of things. We didn't want that to be a distraction from the broader focus of the committee, which is what are some things that can be done? What is a different perspective that could be brought to say, here's how within 91 different municipalities there might be some savings for taxpayers. We have this pool and point of sale tax that's addressed about every 20 years. We're kind of at that point. And as the demographics and the optics of the single county changes, there seems like there's always a critical point where we start to look at these things again. I'm just curious your perspective of, it was interesting to hear Denver's approach versus maybe more of an eastern city's approach. And St. Louis is, I've heard that St. Louis is the farthest west eastern city, and you have Kansas City is the farthest east western kind of city. And we're at this place where the founding of the city really, and I think that the promulgation of a lot of municipalities had to do with our a lot of German immigrants before the unification of Germany. So this is how this all happened. But we're in a different era, and resources are scarce. We're just trying to figure out a better path. You have, what would you consider the most like example, or one of the things we want to pursue is have somebody really take a look at nationally, whether it's case studies or just data about what's happened to other places. I think we're at a point now as a region where we're looking for a better path. We're just looking for a fresh perspective. So I'd be interested in
sure. There's a lot of paths there, as you noted. There's a lot of ways you can do it. Some of it's formal, some of it's informal. It all starts with a conversation. It all starts with a dialogue. It all starts with goodwill. It all starts with a sense of mutual identification. You see, the reality is that the economies are region-based. So our livelihood, our tax generation, the way we engage the world and the national economy is through the metro. Metro is not an abstract unit that people created in Washington one day in the mid-20th century, just from where it dates. It's that people who are economists and sociologists that are requesting a statistic that better reflected where people live because of commuting. And so the statistics based on commuting. It says you've got an employment interchange with a neighboring space. So it starts with the idea that the minute the census finds you in a metro, it found you in a metro because you're in the same region and you'll go through the same regional recession together. Your housing, labor, retail markets are tied. If they weren't, you wouldn't be in the metropolitan area. They leave you out. Government aid is flowing to metropolitan areas, and it's required for things like transportation funding because the federal government won't let you build a road that stops at a municipality because you've got some petty rivalry with a neighboring town. So there's federal aid that says you must administer. In fact, it required metropolitan planning organizations, or you wouldn't get your federal money because what was happening is that the federal government was having literally individual municipalities through lobbyists, through state and local lobbyists, pitch projects that were contradictory to the proximate spaces, that were unplanned without any reference to those spaces. So in the, by the 1990s, the federal government, thou shalt do this. Now there are examples around the country, some of which haven't been followed, some of which haven't been followed, and some of which have been followed in spirit but not in letter. There's a difference between government and governance. Let me explain it. Government is the formal organization of authority. So a city, county integration. Governance is possible without formal codification. So what you have in Denver is divided government, and technically divided government and unified governance. Voluntary. And the MPO process that the federal government required for transportation it turned out that what started with transportation discussions in a lot of metros, like Maricopa County and Nieves, what started with how do we get roads built, how do we get federal money back, how do we get our formula-based aid to the state money back for approximate to the population, ended up becoming discussions about quality of life, about education, about economy, about economic development specifically. And so there's only one place in the U.S. with formal region-wide government, Portland, Oregon. It came out of the 1973 Portland Land Act, the Oregon Land Act, rather, that required the road boundaries, that required you to have this very formal process by which you separated land that you wouldn't develop and then entitled land within the space that you wouldn't develop. Nobody's ever replicated it. Instead, some of the habits and some of the structure from that engagement has served in terms of even the federal request that you cooperate across regions. It's filtered into some of the toolkits around the country for developing methods of cooperation in Metro Denver. Sometimes it's been formalized as revenue sharing in places like Minneapolis, St. Paul. And then there are regions, and I'll say this, that flat out don't talk to each other. Their competitive disadvantage is that if you don't have a collective sense of engagement with global and U.S. economies, then the risk is that the lack of coordination will reduce strategic investments and the willingness to make strategic investments at key points to maintain or to capture new sectors of the economy. And I can tell from a region quickly, from talking with some of the leadership, whether or not they're actually engaged with one another. Well, they're not, or sometimes rival structures emerge. Like, Phoenix began an airport at Mesa in cooperation with the city of Mesa. It wasn't hostile. They're co-owners of it because they talked. There wasn't a formal structure that required it. It's that the civic leadership in the region was talking enough already, had enough engagement on transportation, had enough engagement on economic development, we built the light rail system, that this was a natural outcome of that kind of consensus building. And everybody reached partnership, had a stakeholders base in it, and it's worked out pretty well. And I can point to some examples around the country. This has gone less smoothly. I'd rather not name names. It's easier to name the models of what's successful because the folks who get picked on there enjoy the recognition. But there are regions like Detroit, just a general principle, where there is a central city that has the most hostile relationship with its regional partners that I know of, and I don't think it's been a shining example for economic development, quality of life, or national reputation at this point.
Representative Leara.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We talk about regional economy, and